So have you ever looked at photos from other photographers and wished that they would share their camera settings as well? I know that I certainly did, which is why today I'm going to share with you some example photos along with the aperture, shutter speed and ISO settings that I used, but most importantly, why I chose them. That way you can learn what might be a good starting point for your own photos and see how all of those three elements work together. Now, huge caveat here, you're not going to be able to take those exact same settings, plug them into your camera and expect the same results. You're going to need to choose your own settings because they change based on a number of things, not least the amount of light that you have in the scene. Now, I would also encourage you to choose all three settings yourself in manual mode. It really does make such a huge difference. This is from one of our Auto to Awesome students who felt empowered by making that switch to manual mode. And that is what I want you to feel like too. Now, be sure to stay tuned right until the end when I'm going to share with you how you can get some help in choosing your own camera settings. But for now, let's dive over to the screen share and we'll get started with the first photo. So let's get started with this image here, which is a portrait headshot. Now, this is taken in my living room, natural light only, just the light from the window. And let's take a look at the settings. So the aperture here is f4.0, and that's because I wanted focus really to be on the face here. And you can see that even his ears and his shoulders and his torso is blurring, and that's because I'm so close to my subject that my depth of field is really narrow. Ideally, I think I would have wanted to use a slightly smaller aperture to get a larger depth of field, just to make sure that that eye that is behind the camera right eye to be sharper, ideally. So I think I should have used something like 5.6 here instead. But it's fine the way it is. I still love this image, but just to have both of those eyes, that would have been ideal. The shutter speed here is 1/160. Ideal shutter speed for an adult who is able to sit still. If this was a child who was moving around a lot more, then I would up that shutter speed. And the ISO number here is 1600, and that needs to be a little bit higher because I'm closing up my aperture a bit just because of my distance from my subject. Now, the lens used here was a 100mm macro lens, which is actually brilliant, obviously, for macro, but also great for portraits. This next image is taken outside on a very sunny day. We actually just have a little bit of shade here, but it's full sun this day, so there's a lot of light. Now, because I wanted to blur out the background, I'm using a larger aperture of f2.8. And my shutter speed is 1/800. Now, you might think that's a little bit high because she's stationary, but remember that your settings will control how your image looks and also your exposure. My shutter speed needed to be higher because I'm letting so much light in via my large aperture, and it's a sunny day, so there's lots and lots of light going around. So my ISO number, perfect for a sunny day, is at 100. And the lens used here was 135mm. The next image is taken using garage light. Absolutely excellent. If you are struggling for light, open up the door to your garage. If you have one, pop your subject there, you're going to get fantastic light. It's where I have my little home studio set up. So the aperture here is 3.2. Again, I wanted some blur there. You can see actually if you look at her legs, we have some blur there in the background, but that was a good aperture to make sure that her hands and her face are in sharp focus. The shutter speed here is 1/800. And again, you might think that's high for a stationary child, but this wasn't really due to having too much light. This was due to the fact that this child was actually jumping about like nobody's business all over the place. And rather than, lower my shutter speed, I kept my shutter speed high throughout the whole session because she really did move around a lot. So always keep that in mind, that if you're going to get maybe unexpected movement, keep your shutter speed higher than it needs to be. The ISO number here is 2000, which is perfect for the amount of light that was coming in at that time. And the lens used here is an 85mm. Next one is a macro style shot. Again, taken indoors as my kitchen window, natural light. My aperture here is f6.3. when I'm that close to your subject with macro style images, you really need to make sure you close up your aperture. Now you can see that even at 6.3, I'm getting a lot of blur. You can see the image, the area that I wanted in focus, and the rest is falling out into blur, exactly what I wanted. If I'd wanted more of this in focus, I would have chosen a smaller aperture by using that larger f-stop. Shutter speed is 1/160. Now I'm going to show you also the ISO number here, which was 5000. Now that's quite high. If I had used a tripod, which I didn't want to use because I couldn't be bothered, so I upped my ISO and kept my shutter speed at 1/60, which I needed to be that high even though my Apple isn't going anywhere, just to counteract the camera shake I could get just by my holding the camera and the lens. So ideally, if I should have dug out the tripod and I could have reduced that shutter speed and therefore also reduced that ISO number. And the lens used here, unsurprisingly, is my macro 100mm. Next image here, again, natural light in my living room, just using the window light here. And the aperture used is f2.8 because I wanted to blur out those lights in the background so I could get that orbs of light. My shutter speed is actually a little bit high here because I could have taken this down. It's at 1/250. I think we can both agree that Mrs. Claus here isn't going anywhere. I could have taken that down, which would have allowed me to use a slightly lower ISO number. Now I have to say, I don't need to worry about this. My ISO number at 1000, I'm not going to get noise with the camera that I use if I expose correctly. So I didn't need to worry about it, but I could have reduced that shutter speed to reduce that ISO number again. And the lens used here was my 85mm. Next image is of Snowman, and as you can see, I'm shooting directly into the light here. So to blur out the background, I'm using an aperture of f2.2. My shutter speed is 1/1600. Again, my subject isn't going anywhere, but that's there to balance the exposure because I'm letting so much light in via my aperture. My ISO is at 160. I could have taken that down to 100 if I was being really pedantic, but again, that extra 60 is not going to make the slightest bit of difference, so it's absolutely fine. The lens used here is that 85mm. So let's move on to this image here, which is a starburst or sunburst. So the aperture used here is f16. If you want that starburst effect, make sure that you close up your aperture and that will let you get that. Now the shutter speed here is 1/1250. That's for two reasons. One, that flag was moving around a lot because it was a really windy day, and also because even though I've closed up my aperture, I'm still shooting directly into the sun. So there's a lot of light reaching the camera sensor. Now the ISO number here is 250. This really should be down at about 100. Doesn't make any difference to the final image whatsoever. No concern really that it's there, but just as I say, it could be down at 100. That particular day we were actually visiting a castle, so we're going from really dark rooms out to the sunlight and shaded areas, so it was nightmare for changing your settings, so not everything was perfect here. But the lens used was a 35mm. Next image is a lifestyle image, and this is taken indoors. There's no natural light here. The only light is from the two lamps either side of my subject. So it was not a lot of light in the room, so it's a low light image. So for that, I really opened up my aperture to the maximum aperture, which was f1.4, just to let as much light in as I could in this low light situation. The shutter speed is 1/200, which I think was perfect for this particular image. Although he's not moving around a lot, there is a bit of movement with the head when they get excited. So that slightly higher shutter speed maybe than it needed to be is good for making sure that I'm not going to get any blur if there was any sudden movement. The ISO is 5000 and it needed to be high, obviously because there's not a lot of light in the room here, even though I'm letting in as much as I can via my aperture. And the lens used here was my 35mm, my favorite lens for storytelling. Now, if you enjoyed this free training and you would like some more help in choosing your camera settings, then be sure to download our free manual settings cheat sheet. Now, in that, I share with you the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO numbers that you might want to use in different situations. So it's a perfect complement to this video. You will find a link to it underneath where you're watching it, or go to audrianphoto.com/manual-mode. So that's it for this week. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll see you again soon. So if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and leave a comment below letting me know if this was helpful to you. Please also make sure that you subscribe to the channel, and if you hit that notification bell as well, that will make sure that you get notified every time we release a new training.